Hey guys, MrPokke here. I'm still in Japan right now, and by the time this video goes up, you probably will have seen the previous video that is going to be the Runmei Fantasy, where my TLDR, if you don't want to watch all that, even supports are not going to be prone to getting replaced. So take a look at that if you haven't, but I kind of want to use this as sort of like a bouncing point into this topic right now, which is going to be the state of sustains in Honkai Starville, right? So I'm not sure if you guys have noticed, in the past 1.5 endgame content, I would say, this endgame mode, right, Epoch Shadows as well as the brand new Pure Fiction, both of these modes have introduced a means that your team can technically pseudo-sustain themselves without the need of an actual sustain, in the form of basically the endgame buff granting you the HP regeneration. Now obviously this is going to be targeted for Mighty, because Mighty is a unit that can benefit greatly from this kind of like self heals and everything and to keep him topped up. But it sort of got me thinking, what has been the state of sustains in HSR for like the past couple of months? Because I feel like since day one of, if not the most important implementation, is that when it comes to team building HSR, you need to run a sustain, especially if you're not going for the 0 cycles. If you're going for 1 cycles, as long as your teammate can survive, the end game, the enemies that you're fighting, they will eventually all crumble as long as your team can be survived, right? This is also prevalent not just for endgame but also for Simulated Universe, Divergent Universe, all of the endgame content, the things that you play with. Sustain is an integral part to the HSR team building experience, up until I would say recently, right? I'm not saying that this is going to be a permanent thing, right? We shouldn't be relying on an end game content buff, because these buffs, they don't last forever, right? The moment these buffs expire, you're going to go back to square one. But a greater impact that I would say is, at what point would you be pulling a sustain for your unit? The value of pulling especially a limited 5-star sustain. Because I think the consensus when you want to pull for a sustain, a limited 5-star especially, is that you want to use them in comparison with what other sustains you have. For the longest time, the value, right, the inherent value between all the different sustains, especially if you want to talk about like tier lists and like primal and that kind of stuff, what makes a sustain better is whether they're going to be able to sustain your team better than other sustains, right? Lingsha is very, very comfortable, right? She gives us the cleanse, she gives us the heal, eventually the refreshable shield, when she has the energy, although maybe or not her sustain is very questionable, that's going to be up to you. But the bottom line is we keep comparing these sustains with one another. But what if, from now and in the future patches, what if we compare sustains with supports? And the reason why it got me to thinking is because if our team comms are getting more and more mechanics and synergy which relies on dealing higher and higher damage, despite the HP inflation, by the way, because we are getting introduced to a lot of crazy mechanics. The most prevalent example being the Tribi, Robin, and Sunday setup, which using units like Aglea can absolutely demolish the enemy team with very, very minimal pressure on sustain. Another example, which is going to be a little bit earlier, is going to be the Sustainless Subric, where you run Fugue, Runmei, and Harmony Trailblazer, abusing Harmony Trailblazer's Duns with Fugue's additional exo toughness, and any break DPS with that team can also clear relatively easily, especially if you give the entire team defensive main stats, right? So these two team comps, they are what I would say they are pushing for greater sustain, greater survivability of entire team without necessarily relying on the use of a sustain. So going forward into the future, if I were to pull for a sustain, right, especially a limited 5-star sustain, the inherent value that sustain brings to my team, it shouldn't just be the fact that, okay, it needs to keep my team alive anymore. Because what if I was able to construct a team where a sustainless run is not just achievable, but also achievable on a regular basis? This, in my opinion, it could be seen from a team comp such as Mighty, which is going to be, in my opinion, the third team comp we have seen so far that can run sustainers pretty easily, right? He has a built-in taunt from his ultimate, and every single time he dies, he has like a free revive for up to 3 times, and by the time these 3 revives occur, you will pretty much either kill the enemy or the enemy will kill you. And it has been the case quite consistently throughout my experience with this creator server, right? And in the future, if more and more of these kind of like sustainless team comps pop up, the value of a sustain, especially all these old sustains that we have right now, they are essentially competing with a potential support in the future, because a support's damage amplification at a baseline it will always outperform a sustained damage amplification, because a sustained role is not to help you deal more damage. A sustained role is to make sure that this entire team survives. The only exception to this, I would say, is going to be Hue Hue, because Hue Hue does have the 40% attack buff with 20% max energy regeneration, but she also helps us provide a little bit more of the energy threshold, as well as a little bit more sustainable, the cleanse and everything. But comparing Hue Hue's support capabilities, or like damage amplification capabilities, I would say that almost every single time you would find yourself dealing even more damage if you just replace it with an actual support. This could be Pella, this could be Tian Yun. It doesn't even need to be an actual 5-star. Any of an actual support, you could just deal even more damage with that set team, right? So going forward into the future, if I were to see a version 3 sustain, especially if I was usually talking about my free to play account, what inherent value that version 3 sustain has to bring, in my opinion, it's either they cook up even more team comps that relies on sustainless runs, or they start pivoting the sustain archetype more and more into the support archetype. So an excellent example I can think of is, aside from Ho, Lingsha, right? Lingsha is a unit that's pretty much the most recent sustain, and she doesn't really just sustain, right? On top of the utility that she provides for the break damage, she also deals a ridiculous amount of damage by herself because of the way that her bunnies work, right? Especially when you pair up with your pure vision teams in the super break, she deals so much toughness bar damage if you give her the fuse debuff that oftentimes the amount of toughness bar damage dealt by Lingsha can rival even your main break DPS, which is why her damage capabilities, her damage potential from herself, on top of a 5-target scenario, which makes her also a decent healer for units like D Herta, for Tribi to ramp up more stacks. It makes her more synergistic beyond just a sustained perspective. And the reason why Lingsha has gotten such high praise is not because she's sustaining for like very, very high amounts. It's because the amount of damage, the amount of utility that she's providing as a unit itself. So in this particular point, what if we just took this utility and just slapped it into an actual support unit? Despite the fact that you are not going to be having access to the heals and the cleanse, we are getting more access to these kind of sustainless variations, either through the form of an endgame buff or an actual archetype that basically just has a drastically reduced reliance on sustain itself. Namely, as of this point, Sustainers Surik, right? Sustainers Agleia with Barbin Tribi as well as Sunday, as well as Sustainers Mighty, where you basically just run him and he is going to be the tank that revives 3 times and enemies pretty much die by then, right? So in the future, if more and more of these kind of archetypes come out, I would say that the inherent value of a sustain, when you compare them to a support, they will start to seem a lot lower. Not because that, everybody needs to do a sustainless run, but more so, you don't really have a good alternative for a support in the 4-star department. Whereas for a sustain, you have excellent alternative. For example, units like Gallagher, right? This might be a separate video, but I do think that Gallagher is pretty much one of, if not the most important free-to-play unit for any player in the entire world. But I digress, right? Because we have alternatives. I'm not saying that Lingsha is better than Gallagher, Gallagher better than Lingsha, but the fact that Gallagher can come extremely close to what this sustain has to offer, it allows the player to invest the number of pulls into a limited sustain to instead direct into a limited support, or maybe even a limited DPS if they're still struggling to make a updated team comp when they have been using the same DPS team comp since version 1, especially if they want to save up for like Fate Collab or even Casuals or whatever unit they want to pull for, right? Because every single strategy invested into a sustain is a strategy that could have been invested into sustain and DPS otherwise. Now this point has been brought up back then in the past, where I talk about whether players should even pull for limited sustains in the first place, because I always tell you guys, if you already have 2 limited 5-star sustains and your team is surviving completely fine, then the value of a sustain, it should not be considered, right? It shouldn't be considered between sustain and sustain. It should be considered what is the opportunity cost of you guys pulling for this sustain, because at this point you are basically sacrificing what could be a limited support, a limited DPS, or a support idleness, which some support idleness at this point they are getting pretty well, right? Even DPS idleness are getting pretty well, right? Ever since version 3, almost every single E1 has some pretty game-changing impact compared to all of version 2 or even version 1 supports, right, and DPS, right? So, and I kind of want to use this as like a way to sort of touch on a maybe not so bright future. Because the thing with all the comparisons between the supports and the sustains and everything, it means that eventually sustain still has to sell, right? It is quite unlikely that the entire sustain cast is going to be replaced permanently, right? There's no way that sustains will be gone from a turn-based game, especially a turn-based game that, at the end of the day, a lot of casuals, they do not really know how to maximize the damage output, which means that they do need to rely on a crutch of running a sustain. If you're watching this video in the first place, you're most likely not going to be in these group people, right? You are already maximizing, you're trying to improve your damage output, so it is not going to be that crazy. And since the sustain category is never going to go away, how would they bring future sustains to attract and appeal more poolers? Because the baseline, the bottom line is, if your team can already sustain, do you want more damage or do you want to sustain harder? These two are the only two ways that future sustains can come in and see if they can offer more value to maybe replace your previous sustains. And both of these ways, me frankly speaking, I don't think they're pretty, right? So the first way, right, do you need to deal more damage, right? A brand new sustain comes out, and this sustain, on top of keeping your team alive, can deal substantially more damage than whatever your current sustain is. That would be a very, very appealing reason to pull, especially for players that still wants that bit of comfort, but on top of that, you want that additional utility, additional damage, such as units like Lingsha or even Huo. So these kind of sustains, I would say, is gonna be a route where you will feel a lot less impactful when you want to go back to older sustains like your Luo Cha, your Huan, your Fu Xuan, compared to these kind of crazy utility sustains that merge everything into one. For these kind of sustains, you kind of want to ask yourself, are the value of these kits, are the value of their job of keeping your team alive, are they able to basically compete with another support? Because if you can deal so much goddamn damage to the point where you don't even feel like you need the comfort anymore, then for a player running the all-in damage path, you would find yourself performing even better without the sustain, right? And for players on the other hand that do want the comfort, what's stopping you from using the invested strategies into pulling for your vertical investment scalings into your DPS or your support, right? So that's one way. The other way is, they increase the pressure of sustain in your team, right? It's not a damage, they increase the pressure. You actually need to heal more because the end game content is dealing higher and higher damage. For this scenario, if the solution to this problem is pulling for stronger and stronger sustains that, oh my god, you really, really need the additional durability, you need to survive because they're basically going to one your entire team and you cannot survive without the sustain. If this scenario was to occur, I do wonder if the older sustains can keep up. And the first unit that comes to my mind is going to be Huo. I'm not sure if it's just me, but Huo sustain, in my opinion, out of all of the limited 5 stars, it is pretty much the lowest, because she's also the unit that's trying to do both at the same time. Right? She wants to do both utility plus sustain combined into one and just offer the best of both worlds. But in the event that if sustain pressure gets higher and higher, as we can see from this kind of recent MOC, the players that are dying with Huo, I would say is going to be a lot higher, right? A lot more considerable, because the sustain utilities that she's going to provide is going to be lesser compared to sustain units that give you even more survival, right? Another unit that could be said is going to be Fu Xuan, especially against units like Nikador. She's going to one shot, and Fu Xuan combines all the damage, she's just going to boom, unless your Fu Xuan is built like a brick house, right? So if they were to tune up the damage output from these kind of endgame content, you technically would have a higher value for sustains, right? At this point, it is no longer about just dealing the highest damage possible. You actually want to have a proper sustain, a proper team comp, which could protect your team while dealing consistent damage output over time. But the flip side to this is, if they go by this route, a lot of players that lack access to a good sustain, they might not clear fast enough. They might all in just to heal as much as possible, or even run double sustain just for the sake of sustaining a team, which leads to a huge damage downgrade. And if they don't balance this well enough with like the HP inflation for all of our endgame content, it may lead to a scenario where players are trying to sustain at the same time, but also wants to deal damage, but they are kind of forced in a very difficult position because they want to sustain, then these sustains don't offer enough utility to deal more damage. But if they want to deal more damage, then you're going to be faced with a crippling possibility that because this brand new endgame is dealing so much damage, you're going to die, right? So I feel that the state of sustains right now, it is in a very weird predicament because they are no longer being considered between sustains. I would say that almost every single player in Honkai Star Rail probably has access to 2 limited 5 stars, or rather 2 limited 5 star sustains. And in order to entice for players to pull for even more sustains, it is going to be very, very difficult, and it will most likely result in a change of the environment to sell these sustains to the players. And out of this case, I will feel that it is a little bit concerning. Unless you guys have really been building a proper team, you're not going to be too worried about whether or not this sustain is going to impact your team building, and your performance is not going to change that much, even if you want to use your old sustains, right? So those are my thoughts with regards to the state of sustain HSR. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below. Well, of the day is going to be heal better. Join Twitch, join Discord, join Twitter, all the best. We'll see you guys next time. Take care.